is Bloomberg Surveillance, Early Edition, with Francine Lacqua.
Good morning and welcome to Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Tom McKenzie in London, and here's what's coming up on today's programme. A meeting between top US and Chinese diplomats backfires. Anthony Blinken and Wang Yi spar over balloons, Russia, North Korea and Taiwan. And as we approach 1 year since Russia's invasion, EU members are considering joint purchases of ammunition for Ukraine. And more geopolitical pressures in other corners of the world. Pyongyang conducting a barrage of missile tests while inspectors in Iran detect uranium enriched to levels just below that needed for a nuclear weapon. Let's check in on these markets then. Investors, of course, hoping for a little clarity when it comes to the trajectory from the Federal Reserve. Going to have Fed speakers out this week, of course, the Fed minutes on Wednesday. And then at the end of the week, the core PCE index, which we know is important for Jay Powell and co. And yes, the geopolitics is bubbling to the surface as well. And we're going to delve into that story and unpack the details for you and the implications for these markets. Across Europe, though, you're seeing some modest gains of 0.2%, a very strong handoff from China. Despite that geopolitical overhang, you saw gains of close to 2.5% across the Chinese benchmark. Goldman Sachs expects to see further gains, plus 20% by the end of the year. Here in the UK, the FTSE 100 is gaining about 0.1%. Germany in a similar picture, flat on the CAC Cajon, autos and parts, basic resources amongst the sectors that are gaining. And again, just when it comes to that rate hike trajectory from the Fed, expectations now from the markets are going to get 5.3% by around July of this year, the terminal rate being raised. Let's switch it on and see how things then are playing out across these sectors. I talked about basic resources. Yes, iron ore is gaining, particularly on expectations of maybe slightly better demand from China. Let's get back to the geopolitics. That's the map across these markets. We'll keep across this for you. A meeting then between two top diplomats, of course, from China and the US over the weekend has only heightened tensions rather than easing them between the two sides. Here's what Secretary of State Anthony Blinken said about the recent downing of a suspected spy balloon.
I made very clear to him that China sending a surveillance balloon over the United States in violation of our sovereignty, in violation of international law, was unacceptable and must never happen again.
OK, Anthony Blinken there. Joining us now to discuss is Bloomberg's senior executive editor for international government, Ross Matters. And Ross, what were the key takeaways for you then from this US-China meeting?
Well, the interesting thing from this meeting is that it was obviously designed to diffuse tensions again a little bit after they'd spiked over this Chinese balloon. But if anything, they seem to have made things worse. And that's because a bunch of other things came into this conversation, not just the North Korean tests, which are proceeding apace, but particularly what the US is concerned about is their concerns that China may at some point ramp up its support for Russia that would feed through to the war in Ukraine. And what we're talking about there is supplying lethal weaponry to Russia that would go into Ukraine. Of course, China is not doing that at the moment, but the US is saying there are signs that perhaps that might be under consideration. And it looks like that particular issue is the one that really set things off when the two of these officials met in Munich, was really like China bristling at the suggestion that it's overtly going to be stepping in on Ukraine. And that seems to have really sort of like set back any opportunity that they had here to try and put a flaw under the relationship. The question now is whether there are any other avenues to keep dialogue open and whether officials could meet again anytime soon.
Yeah, and of course it would be a major step for China to start supplying weaponry to the Russians. And meanwhile, Roz, we've had reports of North Korea firing suspected ballistic missiles. Why are they doing this now? The timing is also and always important for Pyongyang, isn't it? And what are they hoping to achieve with this?
Well, that's right. And particularly the thing that happened on the weekend is North Korea fired what we seem to be an ICBM, which is a missile that's capable of reaching the continental US. And that's a real escalation in the missile tests that they've been conducting now for several years, sort of somewhat under the radar, because the US has been very busy, obviously, with the war in Ukraine and with its policy on China. And normally North Korea would be getting a lot more attention. And in the dark, when it doesn't get that attention, it tends to escalate. So we're seeing a pattern there where North Korea is sort of looking to get the world's eyeballs on it. But also, each of these tests enables North Korea to enhance its military regime, enhance its capabilities, and perhaps move towards a proper nuclear test. So that's really the next thing to look for. Does this build up to North Korea deciding to do a test of a nuclear weapon, at which point really the US is going to have to seriously engage?
OK, Bloomberg's Ross Matteson then on the latest of that new geopolitical threat, or at least one that's rearing its head again, which is North Korea and its missile test. Thank you. Now, 2 senior diplomats have told Bloomberg that international atomic monitors in Iran, they've detected uranium enriched to levels just below that needed for a nuclear weapon. It is the second time this month that monitors say they have detected suspicious activity. Bloomberg's Simone Foxman joins us with the details. What does the discovery mean then, Simone?
Well, this is really going to stoke fears that Iran is on the cusp or already is a nuclear threshold state. That is a state with both the technical capability and the fissile material to fire a nuclear weapon. Iran was already enriching uranium to 60%. This material enriched to 84%, and 90% is the threshold you really need for a nuclear weapon. What's not clear to these IAEA, the UN's Atomic Monitoring Agency officials, is whether or not Iran produced this material intentionally. That's what they are looking to find out at the moment, because it could have been produced as a byproduct of other uranium enrichment activity. That said, the region is very concerned about Iran's closeness to a nuclear weapon. We saw actually, and this is a great Bloomberg reporting, discussions between Israeli and Saudi officials about the security and defense for both of those countries, just indicative of how much Iran as a nuclear power could really reshape relations in the region. This is a key source of instability in the Middle East. And the farther Iran gets in terms of enriching uranium, the higher levels it gets, it also means that there's less likelihood for diplomacy, a return to that 2015 nuclear deal that already looks pretty dead, less likely for that to come back into play.
OK, Bloomberg's Simone Foxman on the latest when it comes to Iran and its nuclear enrichment program. We're watching, of course, for the Israeli response, if there is one. Joining us now to discuss how all of the geopolitics plays into markets is co-head of Thematic Equities at 91, Deirdre Cooper. Deirdre, good morning.
Good
Thanks
morning.
for joining us. How do you tie, and if you are tying the geopolitics into your views on these markets, how are you doing that?
Look, I think there's no question that geopolitical risk is higher now than it has been for many, many years. Having said that, we also don't think the right response is a knee-jerk reaction to every piece of news, to every bilateral meeting. And you have to focus as well on the underlying economic environment in each region and, of course, more importantly, the prospects for each particular company.
Where is that economic environment leading you? Where are you seeing the most resilience as we weigh up the prospects of maybe the Fed getting to 5.3? We're speaking to Goldman Sachs earlier. They said they've adjusted their view to around 5.25 to 5.5 potentially for the terminal rate.
So we would agree to that the market is at the moment discounting very much a Goldilocks scenario. And in our view, there's both more risk that inflation stays a little bit higher for longer and risk that the economic outcome is a little bit tougher than the markets might be expecting. So we will be looking for companies that have pricing power, that can manage through higher commodity prices, higher input prices and pass those on. But more importantly, also companies that have structural drivers that can do a little bit better if the economy starts to slow in the second half, which is certainly our expectation.
So on risks and the China role in terms of that drive for commodities, what is the bigger risk around China? Is that the inflationary impact of that renewed commodity demand, or is it the geopolitical risk around China?
So look, the geopolitical risk is a huge tail risk to investing in general, and I'm not sure that the right answer, if you're worried about China-US tensions, is simply to exit Chinese equities. Having said that, as we look at the Chinese market, we see a market, where the policy impulse, the credit impulse, they all troughed last year. We see Chinese consumers that, unlike Western consumers, cut consumption significantly during COVID. So that's recovering now as the country comes out of COVID, and we see very attractive valuations. And then more specifically in the decarbonization and sustainability space, we continue to see selected companies that have really, really attractive growth drivers. We see electric cars, we see the build out of renewables, we see all of those areas as really aligned with Chinese policy, that have really attractive, well into the double-digit growth prospects this year.
Okay, we want to get more on those themes that you drill into, and some more of your calls as well in the next few minutes. Deirdre, thank you for staying with us. Deirdre Cooper, co-head of Thematic Equities at 91. Staying with us, we'll get more of her thoughts and analysis in the next couple of minutes on these markets. This is Bloomberg.
I don't think they can get CPI to 2% without crushing the economy. But that's because 2% is not the right target for our economy. When you have so much stuff going on the supply side, an energy transition, a change in the supply chains, geopolitical issues that come onto the supply side, the way the labor market functions, it's a long list of supply issues. You need a higher stable inflation rate, call it 3 to 4%.
Okay, Bloomberg opinion columnist Mohammed El-Erian then on why the return to 2% may prove challenging. Deirdre, I've got an expectation that you're going to broadly align with that view. You think they're going to go higher for longer. That adjustment then, the impacts across this economy, and if a 5.3% or higher for the Fed rate translates into further downside for inflation, or if you get to a point where actually that move between 4 to 2% on inflation just becomes untenable unless you're going to crush this economy?
Look, I think our view is certainly that the Fed continues, that we have more rate rises ahead of us, and then we also have slower, potentially negative economic growth in the back end of the year.
Are you on a hard landing, slow landing, or no landing?
So I think that's a little bit of a harder landing.
Right.
Certainly not the current very gentle Goldilocks scenario that the market is discounting, which is why I think that really argues for a real fundamental approach to stock picking, looking for companies that can really do well through that much more difficult macro environment.
Okay, and so we want to unpack some of your thematics. And there was a news line that crossed over the weekend around Tesla potentially pitching or making a bid for the metals miner, the battery metals miner Sigma Lithium, which is a reminder of the importance of the supply chain around EVs. And I know this is a view that you have, and you have some expertise on it. How do you invest around that supply chain?
Look, I think we see the whole electric car space as a really interesting area to invest. Interestingly, electric car penetration is by far the highest in China. So about a third of all new cars sold every month in China now are electric cars. That number in the US is low single digits.
And yet the NIOs and the XPengs, those stocks have been crushed.
But the BYDs, which is about 20% market share, is doing a little bit better. But look, the automakers themselves have always been a really tough place to invest. Those are very difficult businesses, big barriers to exit. As you look deep into the supply chain, and I'm not just talking about metals, I'm talking about semiconductors, the analog semiconductors, the power semis that go into EVs, the connectors, the guys that make the machines to make the lithium-ion batteries. So the picks and shovels are where we see the most interesting opportunities. Those are trading at really attractive valuations and have really interesting growth prospects, regardless of the economic environment, because they're coming from that lower base.
Okay, the picks and shovels part of the supply chain around EVs. And meanwhile, ESG has taken a bit of a knock in terms of its branding. And of course, that switch European focus on ensuring that it has that energy and it's not dependent on Russia has meant that a lot of carbon intensive industries, or at least energy supplies, have fired up again. But you're saying that markets are still underestimating the decarbonisation push of some of the companies out there. I just wonder to what extent that narrative that we've seen over the last 12 months has put a shadow over that, or at least a cloud over the decarbonisation push, or indeed opened up an opportunity.
So I think it really is the opposite. I think it's opened up an opportunity. I think what's happened, with the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the potential energy shortages has really led both individuals, companies and governments to realise that the imperative to invest in clean, reliable energy is much bigger than it ever was. So if anyone tells you for energy security we need fossil fuels, just think for a second, we don't import the wind or the sun. We import gas and coal and oil. So the best thing that we can do in order to build a reliable, secure energy system is to invest in renewable energy and energy efficiency.
So what are you looking at storage? Are you looking at wind turbines? Are you looking at the solar panel makers? Where are you focused?
We look through all of those value chains. We look at all the things that need to happen. We just saw Mohamed El-Erian talk about the transition.
Yeah.
That incorporates many, many sectors. We need to decarbonize electricity, then we need to electrify, we need to build a hydrogen economy, we need to invest hugely in energy efficiency, and then you have to decarbonize agriculture, which is probably the hardest area. So it's an enormous universe. And we look very selectively, as I said at the beginning, to find those companies that have pricing power, because it's not an easy macro environment, and can navigate through that, benefit from that structural growth, but really make good profit margins and good returns through the cycle.
OK, Deirdre Cooper, thank you very much indeed on your calls around thematics and how the central banks, of course, are adjusting with views that the Fed will stay higher for longer on rates. Deirdre Cooper, co-head of Thematic Equities at 91. OK, coming up, Rishi Sunak tells Bloomberg that work remains to be done in striking a deal with the EU on the Northern Ireland Protocol. We've got more on that story. That is next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back. Economics, finance, politics. This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Tom Mackenzie here in London. Now, UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak is gearing up for a big political test. That's as he prepares to unveil a deal with the EU that risks a standoff with Northern Ireland Unionists and members of his own party. For more, let's bring in Bloomberg's Joe Mays. Joe, what do we know about where this deal might be? There's been a lot of speculation as to whether or not it is, in fact, going to be announced, possibly as soon as today, maybe later this week.
Well, it feels like we're very close to that deal being finalised. It sounds like the two sides have agreed on issues such as customs, reducing the trade friction that currently occurs between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, things like data sharing. We've made progress there. But really, it's the issue of governance and how much role the European Court of Justice will continue to have in the protocol. And that's the big sticking point with those unionists, as you talked about, and the Brexit purists within the Conservative Party. That's the issue where it feels like Rishi Sunak is trying to get some final concessions out of the EU in the hope he can sell that deal to his party.
And on that point, what are your sources, Joe, telling you about the likelihood that Sunak can, in fact, win over not just the unionists in Northern Ireland, but, as you say, the Brexit purists or the ERG?
Well, it feels like it's really an uphill battle, and my sense is that he probably ultimately won't be able to convince those in his party who have that extremely purist view of sovereignty and how they want no EU law to apply in Northern Ireland at all in this post-Brexit state. But that is built into the protocol. It's coming a fundamental aspect of the protocol that Northern Ireland does follow EU law in part to avoid that border with the Republic of Ireland. And while that's still the case, those Brexit purists will never really be happy. And I think Rishi Sunak might have to just say, OK, I can't get what you want, but I'm going to have to try and proceed regardless because we want to have a deal here. And that's why we're set up for this fight with his own party.
OK, so ultimately, potentially, he could look through that opposition from the ERG, maybe, particularly if he was to take Labour up on their offer, but that would also provide its own political challenges for the Prime Minister. Meanwhile, Boris Johnson intervening in this debate. Why?
Well, I think Boris Johnson perhaps does still have ambitions to one day return as leader of the Conservative Party. And you can see why he might want to create some trouble for Rishi Sunak. He's saying that Rishi should continue with that Northern Ireland Protocol bill. That's legislation which Johnson's government introduced, which would give the UK government the power to override many parts of the Northern Ireland Protocol. It's a bit of a nuclear option, and Johnson's saying you should be proceeding with that to give you leverage in these talks. And Rishi Sunak has paused that bill in Parliament. So he's causing trouble for Rishi Sunak. I think he sees personal gain in doing so.
Personal gain, troublemaker. Who would have thought from Boris Johnson? Bloomberg's Joe Mays. Excellent. Thank you very much for getting us up to speed on where we stand in terms of this potential deal. And we're going to be covering all things UK, of course, every week on Thursdays. That's at 9:30 a.m. UK time in our half-hour special. Let's get to the Bloomberg First Word News now with Leanne Gerrans. Leanne.
Tom, good morning. A meeting between the top diplomats from the US and China this weekend suggests compromise will be difficult for the two sides. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and China's Wang Yi traded bobs on everything from the balloon and Taiwan to North Korea and Russia in Munich. Meanwhile, President Joe Biden heads to Poland today as Russia's invasion of Ukraine approaches its one-year mark. Now, senior diplomats say atomic inspectors in Iran have detected uranium enriched to levels just below that needed for a nuclear weapon. It's the second time this month that monitors say they have detected suspicious activity. It's not yet clear whether Iran intentionally produced the material. And North Korea has fired two suspected ballistic missiles while issuing a warning to the US over joint military exercises. It comes less than 2 days after Pyongyang launched a long-range missile capable of hitting the American mainland. The weekend saw the US and allies South Korea and Japan hold aerial drills in a show of force amid continuing tensions in the region. Global news powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Leanne Gerrans, and this is Bloomberg. Tom.
Leanne Gerrans here in London. Thank you very much indeed. Let's check in on some of the stocks on the move. We are focused on some of the defence companies. Dassault Systems on the back of the news that maybe the Europeans are closer to a joint purchase programme for ammunition for Ukraine. That stock currently down 0.2. Pretty solid gains for SEA. This is an auto parts company gaining 4%. It was a beat in terms of their earnings and upgrade. Rio Tinto gaining 1.5%. Iron ore up. Plenty more coming up. We're going to talk about what is happening in Ukraine. Stay with us. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. Now, your headlines. A meeting between top US and Chinese diplomats backfires. Antony Blinken and Wang Yi spar over balloons, Russia, North Korea and Taiwan. And as we approach 1 year since Russia's invasion, EU members are considering joint purchases of ammunition for Ukraine. And more geopolitical pressures in other corners of the world. Pyongyang conducts a barrage of missile tests, while inspectors in Iran detect uranium enriched to levels just below that needed for a nuclear weapon. Good morning and welcome to Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Tom McKenzie in London. February 24th, 2022 marked the beginning of the war between Russia and Ukraine. 12 months on, and we take stock of some of the human impact, but also the effect on food and energy prices and the consequences for the European economy.
Russia invaded Ukraine in the pre-dawn hours of February the 24th, 2022. This after President Vladimir Putin spent months building up troops along the border. The unprovoked attack sparked the biggest flow of refugees since World War II. Over 8 million Ukrainians have fled the war. Tens of thousands have died or been wounded amid unspeakable brutality. But the impact extends far beyond the human tragedy. The fighting between two of the world's biggest food producers hampered exports from the region. Together, Russia and Ukraine had accounted for a quarter of global wheat trade and half of sunflower seeds and oil. Prices around the world surged, though they have since eased back. The conflict also caused the biggest European energy crisis in decades, especially in Germany, forcing countries to cut their reliance on Russian exports. Before the war, more than 40% of EU imports of natural gas came from Russia, and over a quarter of oil imports. No longer. The soaring prices helped fuel the fastest inflation in the euro's history, forcing the ECB into its most aggressive series of rate hikes ever. A year later, the war shows no signs of ending, although Ukraine has made advances against Russian forces using weapons mostly supplied by the US and Europe. It will take hundreds of billions of dollars to one day rebuild the nation. What comes next may in large part depend on Russia's moves, Western support, and Ukrainian determination, led by a president who's become a household name around the world.
Some of the consequences then of Russia's war in Ukraine 12 months on. Now, European Union members may agree to pull ammunition purchases as early as next month in a push to secure badly needed firepower for Ukraine. Joining us for more on this is Bloomberg's Maria Tadeo. Maria, dwindling ammunition is a big concern for Ukraine. You have been flagging this as a central issue for policymakers. Europe now looking to pool its resources.
Yes, Tom, and look, there was a lot of debate around the fighter jets and the tanks, a lot of the heavy weapons, and of course the spotlight was on it for a very long time. But in reality, what is becoming clear now is that the most pressing issue may be ammunition. You can't have soldiers that are not able to fight because they don't have ammunition. And that was the main message that came out in some extent at the Munich Security Conference. You have to ensure that there is this constant stock that goes to Ukraine and deliveries that happen fast. And this is one of the central issues at this point. This was echoed too by a number of leaders, including the UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, who told me, yes, artillery is a central priority, not just the only thing we focus on, but it is one of the key issues. Let's take a look.
It's clear that the security guarantees, the architecture that was in place before this war has failed Ukraine. Right? That's just a statement of fact. Ukraine had received assurances when it gave weapons up. Russia has continually violated, whether it's human rights treaties or indeed arms control treaties. So what happened before has not worked. So we should be clear about that. And now our job is to look forward and say, what's the right thing going forward? Now, as I mentioned, Jens Stoltenberg has said NATO, Ukraine will be a member of NATO. But between now and then, what I think we need to work on are providing Ukraine with the means to win the war right now. And that means very specifically artillery, long-range weapons, armored vehicles, air defense. That's the most critical thing. What we can also do is make sure that we're training Ukraine on NATO standard equipment. That's what we're doing when it comes to aircraft with their pilots. But I think what we do need to do is think about the future of how we protect Ukraine's security. And we need to have that conversation with our allies and talk about the longer-term provision of supporting Ukraine. And that's the conversation that I think we should start having, because the Vilnius summit is a good place to conclude that.
So this year, so the assurances would come this year. I wonder, there has been a lot of debate. You talked about the fighter jets. There has been a lot of debate here about the ammunition, the risk that they may not have enough ammunition, but also the long-range missiles. There's concern that perhaps one of the targets would be Crimea. Under your watch, as UK Prime Minister, would you approve of long-range missiles that could hit Crimea?
I think the most important thing here to recognise is, it actually starts with NATO. What is NATO is a defensive alliance, right? That's the first thing to recall. What is Ukraine doing? Ukraine is trying to defend itself, right? It is suffering unprovoked aggression. Its territorial integrity, its sovereignty has been violated. Its people are being killed. And it has every right to defend itself. And that's what we should be doing. And that's the support that we collectively in this room are providing. And critically, there are things that Ukraine needs to gain that decisive advantage on the battlefield. That's why the provision of heavy tanks was so important. That's why air defense is absolutely critical. You're right to mention artillery, and longer range weapons also help. Now, those are all the things that will allow Ukraine to defend itself and repel Russian aggression. And indeed, yes, to have a counter-offensive that moves Russia outside of its own country. I think that's entirely reasonable, and we should be fully behind Ukraine in that ambition and want that ambition to succeed.
And for them, the entire country means Crimea, as you know very well. In your speech, there was a lot of bravado in the sense of Ukraine has to win the war and Russia has to be proven wrong. Vladimir Putin has to lose this war. Some would say, and you make it clear, you still believe the UK is a big geopolitical agent. Zelensky obviously went to London. He sees value in the UK, but some here would believe to really be the strong geopolitical agent, you need to solve the pending issues that you have with the EU. I know you probably know this question is coming. There's a frenzy of reports that you do have a deal over the Northern Irish Protocol that could come Monday, potentially. Do you have a deal? Does it come Monday? And I wonder, beyond that, does it reflect your wish that you want to have a normal working relationship with your European allies?
So, lots of things in there to unpack. I think that the first thing to say, when it comes to the issue of the Northern Ireland Protocol, there are real issues that need resolving. The way that the protocol is been implemented, it's causing very real challenges for families, for people, for businesses on the ground, very practical difficulties, and they need to be resolved. But that also there's an issue of the democratic deficit that sits at the heart of the protocol as it's currently constructed. Now, those are the things that we need to resolve. And I'm working very hard together with my ministerial colleagues, foreign secretaries in the audience, Secretary of State for Northern Ireland. You know, we are working very closely together. We're engaging in those conversations with the European Union.
Next week, potentially?
All the time, and we have been for a while. But what I'd say is there is still work to do. I think that there is still work to do. There are still challenges to work through. We have not resolved all these issues. No, there isn't a deal that has been done. There is an understanding of what needs to be done. It's the issues that I outlined, and James was in Brussels yesterday. I've been in Northern Ireland talking to parties there about the things that we need to fix. We're working through those. We're working through them hard, and we will work through them intensely with the EU. But we are by no means done. There is no deal that is done. There's work to do, and that's what we will set about doing.
And that was obviously the UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak. There's always a Brexit angle to everything that we do when it comes to the UK. But to be fair to the Prime Minister, he did go with a massive delegation to the Munich Security Conference. A lot of the officials that I spoke to behind the scenes told me they perceived a changing tone from the United Kingdom. And he also told me, by the way, the UK left the European Union. It did not leave continental Europe. It will be instrumental when it comes to the future security framework that will come after the war wraps up. Now, the two issues, of course, that were left unclear overall by the Security Conference is what is the timeline? A lot of concern about this year, the next few weeks, but it's very difficult to put an end or a date to the end of this war. And then secondly, that definition of victory. What does it mean to win the war in Ukraine? I think at this stage, it really depends on who you ask still.
Yeah, and of course, and you flagged this to the Prime Minister, the importance of Crimea as part of that question. As we await, again, on the time frame, maybe that spring offensive that many have warned about. Bloomberg's Maria Today, of course, excellent there with that conversation with the UK Prime Minister. Thank you. Meanwhile, President Biden set to meet with the Polish president in Warsaw tomorrow. That's part of Washington's efforts to boost NATO defences in the area. The Commander-in-Chief is expected to deliver an address ahead of the one-year mark of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Bloomberg's Anne-Marie Jourdain joins us now from Warsaw. Anne-Marie, you were on the ground this time last year. You were there as Biden visited Poland and made that commitment around that NATO member. What are we expecting? What are you expecting to hear from the president on this visit?
Well, I think, Tom, what you have to do, and good morning to you, is really look to what Kamala Harris, the vice president, said this weekend where Maria was at the Munich Security Conference, and that's the fact that Kyiv is still standing, the unity is still strong amongst the Western alliance, and also the fact that the transatlantic relationship is strong. But the concern that, of course, the West has, particularly the Biden administration, is that there is this risk of fatigue that will set in as the war drags on. And now that we're at the one-year mark, President Biden is going to want to come here with a message of solidarity. And also, what our reporting is that there will be new sanctions on Russia, something regarding export controls and penalties on specific industries and potentially on individuals. So more penalties at the same time as he is trying to maintain that solidarity amongst the Western alliance.
Now we are looking forward and waiting really for full sanctions. It's not only Poland, because we are supplying Czechia, we are supplying Lithuania. When it comes to business contracts and the readiness of our infrastructure, we are ready to refine every type of oil, but we need European solidarity.
That was Poland's Environment and Climate Minister, Anna Moskva, really saying that Poland is backing the United States when it comes to, they want to see more being done when it comes to sanctions on Russia. But it's interesting, Tom, all of this is very complicated. Of course, there's the oil price cap, and we do have those facilities like insurances that banned Russian crude. But at the same time, here in Poland, they still have 10% of their crude makeup coming from Russia through the Druzhba pipeline. This is a number of countries that are still relying on Russian crude, even still a year into the war.
And meanwhile, over the weekend, China's role really back in terms of its prominence. On one side, Wang Yi presenting a peace plan, or at least saying that there's going to be a peace plan coming. And on the other hand, Blinken saying that he is seeing evidence, that the US is seeing evidence that China is considering supplying weapons, which would be a major step, considering supplying weapons to Russia. I was trying to work through over the weekend the Chinese rationale for that step, if indeed that's what they're leading up to. What have you been making of the comments, what we've been hearing from China, particularly as Wang Yi potentially heads to Moscow?
Well, it's interesting because when you speak to U.S. officials, a lot will point to the fact that China may say something in public, but behind the scenes, they are covertly acting very differently when it comes to their support of Russia. And Secretary of State Antony Blinken made it very clear on CBS News. He said the concern that we have now is based on information we have that they're considering providing lethal support. Now, this just isn't any sort of support, lethal support. So the U.S. is really putting China on ward and on guard to not go there and not do this. But as you say, China, of course, is saying something else very publicly. They're talking about a peace plan, and that this is something that they'd like to bring to Ukraine. And it also comes, as you say, likely, according to Russian state media, heading to Moscow.
Yeah, really, really fascinating, the dynamics that are at play here, whether this is a ploy by China to win over the global south as part of that comms mission, whether indeed they are prepared to make this significant step, and then indeed what the US response would be to that. Anne-Marie Horden on the ground for us in Warsaw, and of course the President will be speaking there in the Polish capital tomorrow, and Anne-Marie will be covering that for us. Thank you. Coming up later, we're going to be bringing you an exclusive conversation with the Deputy Governor of the National Bank of Ukraine. That is at 10:30 UK time. And coming up, are you interested in another verified badge on your social media account? Meta's got you covered with a price tag, of course. We have the details. That is next. This is Bloomberg.
Season continues.
The chips are down.
Earnings coming in fast and thick.
A slew of bank earnings this morning.
Bloomberg breaks the numbers first.
Numbers coming through from Shell.
LVMH numbers are hitting the tape right now.
We had a very good set of numbers in the fourth quarter.
We feel confident with the guidance we've given.
The situation has changed completely.
With exclusive expert analysis.
Europe's most valuable company.
Trending towards the higher end of its historical range.
You think that can continue? How do I play this into 2023?
Bloomberg Television and Radio. The fastest numbers and analysis you trust.
Welcome back. Social media giant Meta is launching a subscription service that will include a handful of perks and features, including account verification badges. That is for those who pay, of course. Meta Verified will cost $11.99 a month. That's if purchased directly, and is said to be primarily targeted at content creators. Joining us now is Bloomberg's technology editor, Vlad Savov. Vlad, this seems to be like Meta is taking a leaf out of Twitter's book on this service offer. What do we know?
Yeah, I mean, it isn't the first example of Meta and Twitter doing parallel things. Facebook and Meta is an order of magnitude bigger than Twitter, but they face similar issues. So Elon Musk, when he announced his Twitter Blue subscription, what he was trying to do was address Twitter's chronic problem of never being able to monetize its users properly. Now, Facebook as a service and Meta more broadly have been facing similar things. They took a big hit out of Apple's privacy enforcements on the iPhone, and they face this challenge of incoming companies like TikTok and the like. So the push towards subscription services seems to be broader than just Twitter or Meta. We can imagine more companies will be doing similar things.
Yeah, I guess one sense is that is this a panic move from Meta, given the competition, given concerns about ad spend, given concerns about the Apple impact on their business model, or is it a well thought through decision that is actually going to drive broader revenue for them?
When it comes to panic moves or impromptu moves, those we can more readily attribute to Twitter rather than Meta. They tend to have a longer-term planning in place.
Okay, and what is your sense in terms of what it's going to mean for the business model?
In the immediate term, probably nothing. When you think about how big of a fraction creators are of the overall user base, it isn't that big. But it sets the precedent. It lets people know that there are subscription services. It gets them used to it, much of the same way that things like the $9.99 music subscription service needed time to break through, and for people really to accept that services that used to be free in the past are not going to be that way in the future.
OK, Vlad, thank you very much indeed. Vlad Savov in Hong Kong for us on that latest decision by Meta to start charging for some of its verified policies and verified characteristics, or at least some of the benefits you'll get from signing up for close to $12 a month. Now, to football and Manchester United. This is what's going to be coming up after the break. They beat Leicester City 3-0 yesterday. Good result for Man U. But will the Qataris beat billionaire Jim Ratcliffe in the battle to buy the Red Devils? We'll bring you the latest score in that match next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back. Economics, finance, politics. This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Tom Mackenzie in London. Now to football, and the bidding war for Manchester United is heating up. The suitors include Britain's richest man, Jim Ratcliffe, and a member of the Qatari royal family. For more, let's bring in Bloomberg Opinion's Matthew Brooker. Matthew, you've been looking through all of this. You've been in the weeds on this bidding process, what it means for Man U. Let's start with Sir Jimmy Ratcliffe then. Can we really consider him to be a front runner in this process? How much is he going to play up his links to the club?
Yeah, I think it's very difficult to say if there is a front runner and who the front runner is. I mean, I think if we're looking just at who can afford to bid the most, then I think of the two bids that we know about at the moment, you have to consider the Qataris the front runners, purely because they've got the deepest pockets. I mean, the Qatar's sovereign wealth fund has got assets of like $450 billion. I mean, we don't know the extent of the wealth that this particular member of the Qatari royal family can access, but you know, we can be sure that it's considerable and probably a lot more than Jim Ratcliffe can muster.
Yeah, poor old Jim Ratcliffe, even he is going to struggle to compete with that depth of wealth. But this is so the Glazer family is looking at some reports of like $6 billion, which would be incredible, wouldn't it? What else do we know about the Qatari bid?
Yeah, I mean, we don't. For one thing, we don't know that much more than we knew on Friday before this initial deadline for bids. We don't have a figure. Bloomberg has reported that it would value the club at somewhere around $6 billion. That's not wildly different from where Manchester United shares are trading now. That would give them an enterprise value of about 5.2, 5.3 billion. And clearly, given the uncertainty around it, there's some discount priced in there. What they have said is that it would be debt-free, which is pretty significant. I think a lot of the disenchantment with the Glazers, which goes back a long way for Manchester United fans, has been in the way the club has been leveraged, which fans see as having starved the club of the investment that it needs. And the Qataris have also said that they will invest in the stadium, in the team, and in the training facilities, which is something that I'm sure Manchester United fans are going to be very glad to hear.
OK, Bloomberg Opinion Editor Matthew Brooker, thank you very much indeed. Read his columns and, of course, have the latest on that unfolding story. Let's quickly check on your markets. Here in Europe, you're seeing losses now, just 0.1%. Futures lower in the US, closed, of course, for President's Day. Futures pointing to a downside of about 0.3%. Plenty more coming up. Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition continuing in the next hour with Matt Miller in New York and Anna Edwards here in London. This is Bloomberg.